Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Welcome to edition 81 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. Today's topic is about supplier management. Obviously, it's very important. Ingredients, we all have ingredients and products and inputs into our business and services as well. And it's important if our outputs, our products to our customers are going to be good, that we get our supply chain under control and well managed. And today's guest presenter is Jennifer McCreary from NSF International, and Jennifer is going to be giving us some tips on how we will achieve that. So I can see you all typing in the sidebar, which is great. Welcome to all the regulars and all the new ones. Yeah, feel free to type your comments in the sidebar, and also throughout the webinar, you can type questions which we'll flag and pick up at the end. Just to say, today's webinar and Food Safety Fridays program is sponsored by AIB International, Metal Toledo, Trace Analytics and Safely 360. They bring this program to you, support us in doing this, and get you some free education and a free certificate of attendance. So I can't say further than that. Okay, at this point, I'd like to introduce you to our special guest, Jennifer McCreary. Jennifer's presented 2 or 3 times with us now. If you can switch your webcam on, Jen, if you're there.
I'm here.
Yeah, you've been, is it 3 times or twice, Jen?
I think this is the 4th time.
Oh,
yes, I believe this is the 4th time.
And so some of you will recognise Jennifer, and you're calling in from?
I'm calling in from Toronto, Canada.
Toronto, Canada. And the first person to say hello in the chat bar today was Rajesh from Toronto.
I saw that.
Made you feel at home. Okay, Jen, if you want to get your slides ready, you can just take it away from there. In the sidebar, ladies and gents, there is no Food Safety Friday for next week, but the week after there will be, which we'll send you details. But next week we've got Practical HACCP Food Safety Teams with Tony Connor. It's a 4-hour class online webinar, $97. If you want to join us, bring your team along, click and find out more. I'll be back for the Q&A later, but for now, I'll hand you over to Jen. Good luck.
Okay. Good day, everybody. I'd like to first off thank Simon and the entire FSQN team for this opportunity to speak with you today, and hopefully be able to bring you some information to look at your existing food safety program, existing supplier management program, and perhaps improve it. And for those of you who might be just in the process of setting up a supply chain program, that give you some tips and some potential tools to be able to use for that program. What my plan is today is to go through why a supply chain approval program is necessary. This may be because one of the things that you are having to do is to get management on board to understand what why they need to do this, why there needs to be a supplier approval and verification. We'll look at a bit of an overview of some of the regulatory and some GFSI requirements for supply chain approval, and then look at what the components are of a supply chain approval, some things that I've worked with. And so we'll look at some of the what, who puts it in place and how it puts it in place, and then to make sure that I hopefully leave some time at the end for Q&A. That said, this is the 4th time, and I sometimes run over time, so I'm trying not to do that today. So when we look at our supply chain program, and this is really for those of you who perhaps have a supply chain program that's already in place, and these are some questions to go back and have a look at your program and just to say, okay, how well can I answer these questions? Some things to consider are you sourcing your ingredients? Do you know where they're coming from? Are they coming from countries that have an equivalent food safety program to what you would expect of your domestic suppliers? Or are they coming from a country where perhaps food safety is not quite as highly regarded? And so you need to look and know what, kind of where those ingredients are being sourced from. There's also sometimes there may be some inherent kind of geographical risks that come from where products are sourced. I was speaking with someone recently who was bringing in some agricultural products, and the soil where the material is grown has a high lead content. It's just it's there. So she said that's one of the things that they check when it's looking at it. So they look at where that's coming from. It could be that farming practices where it's coming from could be different than what you use domestically, that we know that there are some countries that use human waste as fertilizer. So it's looking and saying, okay, where are they coming from? Are there agricultural practices, geographical risks that we may not normally see with where we're sourcing other products from? The second thing to consider is what hazards and risks do your ingredients have? Where there's kind of known biological, chemical, physical hazards that could be in particular products, but are there ones that your supplier may be introducing that's there? So what are the hazards and the risks that are coming in? And so it's looking at who's controlling that risk when it's there. Is it something that you're expecting your supplier to control? In which case you have to make sure that they have control of that they've validated that control that's coming in place. Or is it something that there's a hazard and you have in-house a control yourself that's going to take care of that? So it may mean that even though there is a hazard on the ingredient coming in, you've already got it taken care of. So for example, if you're purchasing liquid eggs, you may be relying 100% on your supplier to pasteurize those eggs and eliminate any salmonella from coming in, versus that you have a cooking step in-house that, as long as it's been pasteurized and the potential has been lowered, at least you have the control in-house to take care of that. And then the last one is really the supply chain, because sometimes we look and we're focused on the material, but what about who's supplying that material to you? Do you know what their practices are? Do you know what other potential hazards that they could have? And if they're sourcing it from another supplier, what is your supplier's programs in place to make sure that they're not sending something in to you? So these are all things that we have to look at when we're looking at that supply chain, that it's not just the material itself, but is it possible that who's ever supplying it could introduce a hazard that we need to consider? So these are some of the things when we're looking at supply chain to consider. We're going to talk a little bit about why. And these are just three examples. I know, unfortunately, it seems just about every day that we're seeing another incident that's come up in terms of supply chain, that there wasn't as strong a supply chain approval in place, and so a supplier has introduced a problem. For those of you who are been at an SQF conference last year in 2016, SQF looked at the recalls that had happened with from their suppliers, and what they looked at is they found that 31% of the recalls that an SQF supplier had to put in place were the result of a problem or an issue that had been sent in to them from a supplier. So it's really making sure that that supplier approval is there. So in this case, the first one, it was that a chemical hazard that happened because some of the honeybee, the farmers, were using a banned antibiotic, which was carried through in the honey that was there. The second one, the copper sulfate, this was a food fraud that some of the suppliers had kind of olives that had been left over from the year before. They'd lost some of their color, and so they used copper sulfate to paint the olives that were there. So we had a food safety hazard that was an economically motivated adulterant that was put in place. So we have supplier approvals not just for food safety, but also, unfortunately, it seems more and more today, is that looking at food fraud. And then the last one was just an example of that they believe was probably from when the hepatitis A and the pomegranates, that when the pomegranates were being processed in Turkey, that perhaps some of the folks who were working with those pomegranates, unfortunately, we got hepatitis A into the product. It came through. They were being used in smoothies with. And when they went out, people got sick as a result of it. So part of looking at that supplier approval is making sure that the supplier isn't using a banned substance or economically motivated that's going to end up with us having to recall that product. You may also have to put, it may be a mandatory requirement for you that you put supplier approval in place. That GFSI, it is a requirement that what it is that any organization that's kind of using suppliers, that they have to put a monitoring program in place. And so it's the evaluation, the investigations, and follow-up action, that corrective action that's there. And so I'm just using 3 of the different GFSI programs. The upper left one is SQF, and so they've in this case, it's a mandatory program, that there's a supplier program in place that's there that looks at that approval of the supplier. Is it in the specifications? What's the corrective action? What's the verification? And similar to BRC, the food safety, and FSSC 22000 with the ISO 22000. One thing that I just want to highlight this is sometimes when we're thinking about suppliers, we think of those external folks that are supplying us materials. With the SQF program, and this is certainly something that to keep in mind when you're looking at any of the GFSI programs, but SQF has brought it forward, is that supplier is not just your external people, but it is also your sister facilities. So if you're getting materials from a sister facility, somebody who's under the same corporate ownership, they must be part of your supplier approval as well. And most of the new ones that are coming in for supplier approval, I mean, we've had this always for food safety, but what they are now also looking at is that economically motivated food fraud that's in place. So we've sort of expanded from just the food safety into that food fraud. And then the third reason is that oftentimes it's a regulatory requirement. And I realize that there will be regulatory requirements in all of your different countries. And I was looking at the list that was along the side of the different folks who are participating this morning, but I want to just kind of talk a little bit about the one that probably most of us are involved with right now, is either putting it in place or having a customer who's asking us to be in conformance with it, and that's the US FDA, the FISMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. And with this one, there's kind of two key components that look at supplier approval, and that what it is that for the preventive control rules for both human food and animal food, they both have a requirement that you have to ensure that if your supplier is fully controlling that hazard, that you don't have a means to control at your facility. So it's a supply chain preventive control that's in there. You have to have documented how you're going to approve that supplier, the ongoing verification of that supplier to make sure that they're still following those practices, and then what are you going to do in the event of a supplier nonconformance? So what's your corrective action going to be? The second part that's under FISMA is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And if you are a processor in the U.S. that it's in full conformance with the preventive controls rule and the supply chain rule, you're in conformance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. But if you happen to be an importer, that with this one is that that's not a further processor, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program is saying that, again, you have to do a hazard analysis, kind of look at the risks that your supplier is coming in, assess whether that supplier has full control of those hazards, and then again that ongoing verification and the approvals that would be there. One thing that we have been finding, and this is just something for those of you who are not in the U.S., is that Foreign Supplier Verification Program is only a U.S. entity that can put that in place. So if your customer in the U.S. is asking you to sign the Foreign Supplier Verification Program or to do the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, that's not something that you can do. It is only a U.S. entity that can put that program in place. So we've got lots of reasons, both from preventing food fraud and food safety, GFSI requirements, supplier requirements to have that supplier approval that's there. So let's look at what is involved in putting that supply chain control in place. So first off, it has to be documented. It is a program that's written that says how you're going to do this. So how are you going to determine what the known or reasonably foreseeable hazards are in the product? How are you going to evaluate that, use that to approve suppliers going forward? So in terms of that documentation, you have to, you can use what you've known historically, kind of traditionally in the products come in. So it's similar to kind of that if you were putting a HACCP program in place, it's that known or reasonably foreseeable hazards that would be there. So there's a number of resources that are available for doing this. Your own company history is one of the primary ones that's there. Industry association, identifying what the hazards that would be in place. And then there's a few resources FDA has published on their website. There's a draft guidance document on a hazard analysis and risk-based preventive control. So you can look at that to look at some hazards. For those, I've seen some different ones coming up from Canada that was here. CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, has a searchable database online that for those of you who are in other countries, if you just Google CFIA hazard database, that would come up. And so all of these things are where you can find out information. One thing to keep in mind here is make a note or identify the source of that information. Part of this is so that you can use that to substantiate later when an auditor comes in who perhaps questions the source of the information. You want to be able to identify that, where you got that from. It's also valuable, and when you've gone back later on to review your program, that it allows you to know, okay, what was the information? Where did I have this from before, to go through and to review it. And when it talks about the reasonably foreseeable hazards, really looking and saying, like, is your supplier working with allergens that aren't used in your product? You want to know what's the potential for that allergen cross-contact to get into your product? What are the practices that they have in place to prevent that? And then the other one that I think of is if you are going to be using that material coming in a non-traditional way, is part of that is to make sure that your supplier knows that. I had an example of someone who supplied oatmeal, and they rely on the low water activity of the oatmeal to keep that product safe. And so what they found out was that their customer was actually mixing that into fruit and putting it into yogurt that was increasing the water activity and perhaps in creating a food safety hazard that the oatmeal supplier hadn't considered. So part of it is really communication with your supplier as well. That's there. And then evaluating the risks is looking again that, is it a risk in my facility? Is it something that I'm controlling the hazard that's there, or is it something that my supplier is controlling? And we'll look at the last three bullets, that evaluation, supplier verification. I'll be talking more about those in some later slides, but this is really what you need to look and to say, okay, do I have those things in place as part of my supplier that's there? The second thing is that who should do this? And I've used a term out of FISMA, the qualified individual that's there. And even if you're not FISMA, I think this is still important that we're using somebody who's qualified and that they're qualified, that we're looking at their qualifications, we're documenting their qualifications. What is it about their education, their training, or their experience that makes them qualified to be able to review the hazard the hazard assessment, the risk assessment that would be for those incoming materials. Are they familiar with those materials? Are they familiar with the process? And I have a story. I always think about this one in kind of looking at competencies. I had an acquaintance who they made cheese. Their company made cheese, and they were supplying it to a customer. And one day their customer, one of the individuals at the customer who was doing a supplier approval, called them and said, we're not going to be able to buy your product anymore. And when they questioned to make sure it wasn't a food safety issue, their customer had said, no, our company isn't going to purchase from anybody who uses allergens. Well, I'm not sure if you all know, but cheese, in order to make cheese, we use milk. It's one of those things that's there. So it was unfortunate the person who was doing the evaluation didn't have that understanding of what the processes were. My acquaintance said that they sort of laughed, and about 2 days later, I guess this person called back kind of sheepishly to say that they would be continuing to purchase from them because they couldn't find anybody who made cheese that didn't have an allergen in it. One thing is that with this one is it does not have to be an employee of your company, because you may not have someone in-house who has all of that understanding of different hazards with materials, the processes that are in place. And so, that can be something that you can outsource that to different companies. It's part of it is that looking and making sure that if you are going to be outsourcing it, does that company who you're outsourcing it to, do they have a number of people who have all of this different background that's in place? And the last one is especially one that's difficult for us, is does that person who is making that assessment of the supplier, do they have the ability to read and understand the language of the supplier? We're getting materials in from global suppliers around the world, and so specifications, information, supplier programs are often written in different languages. And so does that person who is looking at that, are they able to understand and comprehend the language of the information that's being provided in? And I think probably the last one in terms of who is just making sure that that person, when the information is coming in, is looking at that information, that it's not just a case of it coming in, they're ticking the box saying, okay, I have information from that supplier, and filing it away. I was conducting an audit at a facility that they were making a claim is that they were looking at that was there. They were saying that they were peanut free. And when I looked through from their suppliers, I noticed that 3 of their suppliers had peanuts that were processed on the same line. When I asked them, well, how do you know that the suppliers who process peanuts, how do you know that that's safe? And they looked at me. Nobody had ever noticed that that supplier had run peanuts on the same line. So it's important when that information is coming in that it is being reviewed. So how, this is really up to you. It's part of it is making sure that you haven't missed any ingredients, that you haven't missed any suppliers. You often have secondary or third, multiple suppliers, including making sure that all of them haven't been missed. And that can be, going back to purchasing, back through some records that would be there, looking at that. And so it can, kind of grouping that material that's in place however it makes sense for you. Part of, sometimes some companies will say, okay, we're going to group the dried materials, but you want to make sure that you haven't kind of gone too general, because there's a big difference in the hazards and the risk with salt versus dried milk powder. So it's looking that they have some similarities in terms of the hazard. So it's documenting all of that, looking at those materials. And then it's, again, looking at what the hazards that would be in those materials, and then assigning a risk level. And remember, with risk is the likelihood or the probability of something occurring, and then the severity of harm that would come from that hazard. And so some of the different risks, sometimes look at low, medium, and high. Sometimes it's a number system that's in place. The key thing is to make sure that we're using it consistently, is that if different people are doing some of this risk assessment, that you've done some training with those folks who are doing that, so that they are all looking and they are all assessing a high, medium, a low, or a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that they're all assessing that the same way. So that can be doing some tests, that can be, giving them some different situations, just to make sure that there's consistency that was there. One type of kind of assessment that I've seen done is companies who look at both, we've done the material risk, so the material, the hazards, the likelihood, the severity, is comparing material risk and supplier risk. So in this case, supplier risk was across the bottom and material risk was up the side. Looking at this is that you could have different suppliers who are supplying you with the same material, so that when we look at material risk, the material risk could be the same, but the means that the supplier is using to produce it could introduce some different hazards that would be there. And I remember once I was working with some caramel color, and caramel color, one of the hazards that we had identified was the potential for sulfites in the caramel color to do with the process. And with one supplier, they had one particular type of process, and we had about 25 parts per million sulfites, which was very low when we added it to the formula. Whereas when we purchased from another supplier, they had about 500 parts per million, or about 20 times the sulfite level that was in place. And so what it did was it required a labeling change for our product, because the sulfites were above the declaration level in the product. So it's looking at not only the material itself, but who is supplying it, what is their process. Another one that I had was looking at, we received sesame seeds in from 2 different countries. Same type of sesame seed, same to go through. One was very good, very clean to go through. The other one, because of they didn't have a good pest, we have different pests and insects and things that were found in those sesame seeds. So they introduced hazards that perhaps weren't kind of inherent of the material, but they were in there because of the supplier. So some things to consider when we look at supplier. What's the country of origin? Again, looking at that food safety system. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is just because a product comes from a country that has an equivalent food safety system, don't just say, okay, they're fine. Ensure that that supplier is operating under that food safety system. Do they have any ongoing problems with the regulator for that product that's in place? Confirm that they're actually captured under that food safety system and that they undergo the audits. In terms of supplier risk, we often look at their supplier status. So it's not just that they've had a third-party audit, but is that third-party audit, is it a GFSI audit or is it a GMP audit? Did it actually look at the information that you are concerned about with your product that's there? In this case, again, part of this in terms of the material risk and the supplier risk, what's really key is who is controlling that hazard. Is it you? Is it your supplier? Is it your supplier's supplier? Or it may be a customer. So looking at that, if your supplier or your supplier's supplier controlling that risk, you must make sure that they've got processes in place to control it. Sometimes, and I've seen some folks kind of asking for where they can get information. Here's a couple of supplier evaluation resources that I've used to go through. Often countries and I mean, I would also use CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that was there. Most countries keep a database. They make it publicly available where there have been recalls of the product. But this can be if you were sourcing materials from other countries. Looking at USDA, there can be publicly available for they are published what the recalls are. So you can look and see, have the suppliers that you're going to be purchasing from looking to approve, have they been part of a recall? Have they been refused entry into the country? Are they under a regulatory warning right now? The one on the right, that's the European Union, the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed. It looks at human food, animal feed, and packaging. And again, there's a database that you can go into and it will talk to you about what recall, what products were under recalls. Was a product detained at the border? Or was it rejected at the border, and some information that was there. So you can look and see that what your suppliers who are coming in from other countries, is there information already available to you that if this is someone new, existing suppliers, we have our history, new suppliers, are there any regulatory actions against them that could mean that we could have some problems, that they may be sending some problems into us? So this is just a couple. There's a number of them that would be available. Okay. So once we have approved our supplier, we have to then make sure that we've got ongoing supplier verification activities. So are they continuing to follow the programs that you had approved them to follow? And so one of the things is conducting an on-site audit that's there. This one is not this, and these are not all required. Now, an on-site audit is required in the event that that supplier has a serious adverse health hazard that's controlled by the supplier. So something that's either for animal food or human food. So that serious adverse health consequences does require an on-site audit before that supplier is approved, and then annually thereafter to go through. So when we look at supplier verification activities, I'm going to talk about a number of them. It's not one size fits all. So what you're looking at there is that what your hazard analysis indicated. Who's responsible for controlling that hazard? Again, is it something that you're controlling, your supplier, your supplier's supplier? So for example, you could have, if you were bringing in a crop that a field crop that you knew that was potential for aflatoxin, if you're buying that material, that from a mix plant, it would be looking at the certificate of analysis from the mix supplier, whereas the mix supplier may have to go back and they may have to do additional testing. So whoever's controlling that hazard is going to help you to know what verification needs to be in place. So if you were just buying the mix, it may be a C of A that you would look at versus an on-site audit. Another means of supplier verification activities would be a records review. And so this is a review of the food safety records, and as we talked about earlier, that this is a qualified individual who's reviewing those records and looking at that you've set it up. It might be a C of A. It might be if the process you wanted to know that there was a cooking step, you might have them provide you with what their the temperatures, the times, all of those, their records for that. Key here in verification activities is to ensure that the information you're reviewing is coming from the site that's supplying you the material. I had someone who had talked about that they had approved one site. Their company was supplying them had multiple sites, but they had only approved one site to supply them the information. And when they got looking at the records that were coming in, they found that that the information was coming from an address different from the address that they had approved. And so when they were looking at the supplied records, they were, asking for a GFSI certificate and going through. So they were not getting the records from the supplier, from the actual site that was supplying them. When they questioned the supplier said, "Oh, this facilities are all the same." So it's something that if you're going to be looking at those records and going through, is making sure they're coming from the site that you have actually approved. A third way of doing it is sampling and testing. So this can be sampling and testing that perhaps your supplier does the sampling, sends it out for testing, you get the results that would be in there to go through. But it's up to you as the receiving facility, the person the company who's getting that material, is you've identified what needs to be sampled. You've identified how it's going to be sampled. So, we don't want that supplier perhaps cherry picking the samples or picking good samples that was in place. So, that maybe they've taken one scoop off the top of, off of a day's production. So you want to identify how that sampling is done, what the testing, what the testing method that needs to be done that's in place, the frequency of that. So you, as the receiving facility, the one who's approved the supplier, this is up to you to have done that. Going through. And then the last one is supplier is other activities, something that that is going to tell you that that program's still continuing to work. And one that I've seen some companies use is that their supplier actually has a regular government audit that's in place. That they're in there, doing the government's in there doing some verification activities once a month, and so their supplier with the results of that government verification. And so it allows them, the supplier's government has done some of that, and then they may do some other things as well. But it's really looking as those activities that you're able to demonstrate that supplier is following those programs that you've set up, that's in place. When we look at supplier verification audits that are here, just some things that you want to look at. If you're going out to do the audit, you want to make sure that who's ever from your company is going out to do that they're qualified, that is in place. Do they understand the process? Do they understand what the hazards that would be for that particular product that's being made, that particular ingredient that you have. So you want to document what the qualifications are that are there, so that they know what they should be looking at and what results they should be seeing. If you were relying on third-party audits, this is something, again, to just confirm that the address that you are getting that third-party audit for, that it's for the company that you are going to be purchasing from, and that certificate is also authentic. We've been hearing more and more about some fraudulent certificates. And so it's not just getting the scan of the GFSI that comes through, but it's for you to go back and confirm, going back to the actual scheme owner, to their website, to the database, and confirming that that certificate that you're basing your verification on actually came through, that it was for that particular company, that particular address, and that it also is looking at the process that your product is coming from, so that it's not looking at, cheese making and you're looking at peanut butter that's there. So you want to look at the roasting of the nuts. So it's really making sure that that third-party audit. One other thing, and this is always interesting, that with companies, is that often all they want to release is the certificate that's in place. But I think when we're looking at supplier verification audits and going through, is that one thing that when I'm working with a company, is I really recommend that you not only get the certificate, but you also get the corrective action. So what were the non-conformances that were identified during the third-party audit, and what was the corrective action that was done? Because we all know that the GFSI certificate, or like the BRC, SQF, FSSC 22000, or any of the GFSI, that certificate isn't issued until all of the corrective actions have been completed. But it's still important to know from your supplier, what were the problems that they had? What were the things that that needed to be addressed? Even though they've been corrected, what were the things that, that they probably should have been on top of in the first place, that was there? With record keeping, is that with this one, if you're going to have a record review, does the supplier maintain records in a format that's not going to deteriorate? That's there. If it's if it's hard copy, how are they storing that? Are you going to be able to get, if you have to go back and review those records, are you going to be able to do that? If it's electronic, are they in a format that's going to be accessible through sort of any standard commercial software that's in place, that's available? And so as well, if your supplier happens to be maintaining some of these records, you go on, you review them. One thing to keep in mind is that under some of the regulations, the FISMA regulations, if those records are at a supplier, they must be available within 24 hours. And so it's important to make sure that, if something, with different time zones, et cetera, that are in place, have a look and make sure that you'd be able to access those records in 24 hours if FDA had made a request to you to do that, or an auditor had made that request to you to do that. One thing as well is if the records happen to be stored with your supplier, if you discontinue that supplier, you're going to still be able to have access to those records that they maintain. That there's that 2-year window that you want to make sure you still have accessibility to those. Sampling and testing here is that, again, it's for you as the receiving facility, the one who is purchasing this. What sampling needs to be done? What sampling method that's there, so that you know that it's representative? What methods are you expecting them to use? Most GFSI programs, they will say that those kind of laboratory qualifications is ISO 17025. And so it's important that if you are relying on laboratory analysis from an outside lab through your supplier is that you know that those results that you're getting from that laboratory, that you're able to depend on those. So this is some of the things to look at. What's the sampling method? What methods are they using? Qualifications of the testing facility, and how, and as much as that is qualifications of the person who's doing that test. Is this a test that they're doing all the time? And so they've got, backup industry practices that would be in place there, or is it something that they've done one-off, and so you may not be quite as confident in the results that you're getting. So part of it as well is that, so we've approved the suppliers, we're verifying them. We need to have ongoing supplier assessment. And so this is ongoing supplier of our supplier approval program to go through and to look at that. And so it's being able to communicate back to the supplier, be able to communicate within our own company the things that have happened, because sometimes when we look at purchasing, we may be, somebody may be looking and thinking the supplier is great because they've got a great price, but we're having all kinds of problems with their product in the facility. And so it's looking at kind of a scorecard that it looks at not only the purchasing process, but receiving. Do they deliver on time? Do they deliver to when they say they are? How is it working in the facility? When QA, if there is a problem, how easy is it to that they are responding to you? And then documenting all of that in place to go through. Investigate it, look at trends. This is an example of a customer complaint by reason, kind of for those of you who are familiar with Pareto's, to look at those 80-20. So it's looking and saying, okay, what were kind of the complaints we had, and be able to go back to the supplier and follow up with them. One of the things that's nice to do is also ask them about their complaints. If they say that they have no complaints, that's something that you may want to just question, especially if you're having some problems. So is that a sign of a weak program that they have? Or perhaps, they don't even have a complaint process in place, or perhaps their complaint process isn't collecting it. We had one situation with a company that the way that they had determined that if they didn't have full information, so when the complaint came in, if they didn't have, who it was, where it came from, the address, etc., if they didn't have full information, they didn't put it into their complaint trending. So they looked like they had very few customer complaints, but when you actually looked, there was a lot of information that wasn't going into their customer complaint process. So it's looking at how are they tracking it. And then part of this is again, all of these things. So corrective action. So what is it that you're going to do if something goes wrong? And I think part of the most important thing of this is, are those items, issues, clearly documented? Look at your contracts, purchasing contracts with these suppliers. Is it spelled out that if they have a problem, they need to contact you? Do they know who they need to contact in place? Is it, do they know what the expectations are from a food safety place, from a food safety standpoint that's there, that is in place? So are those clearly documented to go through? In some cases that I know, when I was in the industry, this would come up. I want to discontinue a supplier, and they go, no, they're the only ones who supply that product. So, in those cases, you still have to make sure that supplier, if it's something that they're going to have to control, you can't just say, well, they're the only supplier, we just have to purchase from them. Even there, it's looking at, can you work with them? Can you help them to correct the situation? Can you do some training with them, help them put their program in place? It's really looking at what you can do, because you just can't just say, oh, they're the only people who can do this, and we're stuck with it. You either have to work with them to put corrective programs in place, or you have to make sure that you have a robust program within your own facility that's going to correct or eliminate that hazard that's there. One thing, and it's not normally it's not normally a requirement that's in the different programs that I see, but if you have suppliers, let's say suppliers that you haven't approved, I keep documentation on those as well, because it helps to be able to show that your supplier approval program is working. Okay, here's all of the documentation on the ones that we have approved. Here's the documentation on the ones that weren't approved, that were there. So I like to keep all of that documentation, both for supplier as well as for ones that we didn't going through. And just in summary to go through is definitely use approved suppliers. Make sure you've got that program documented and that it's focusing on what matters most for food. In this case, it was really looking at food safety, but oftentimes with customers, we want to look at what's on food quality as well. Is that have that's there. Remember, yes, I realize it does take time to do all of that supplier approval and that supply chain verification activities, but I ask is that compare that to the time that it's going to take you to handle a recall, that in the event that a supplier sends you in a problem. Remember, as I said, with SQF, they said that when they looked at about 31% of the recalls that happened were because of an issue that was sent to the plant from one of their suppliers. So think of it that you are protecting your company, and that looking at that, protecting your brand, but also protecting your own self from having to handle that timeliness of a recall that's in place. And then finally, continually assess the results. What's worked for your supplier approval program? What changes do you need to put in place? If you've made a change for one supplier, is that something that you should be putting in place across the board? So it's really continually assessing those results. Are they working for you? That's there because, and just part of this with suppliers is, and I know you've heard this one before, if we don't approve the supplier, it's very likely that we're the ones who are going to get their problems. And if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. So you want to make sure that you have no garbage coming into your facility, and that there's no chance of garbage going out from your facility. That's only good quality, safe product that you are supplying your customers. And with that, whoops. One slide back. I think I just finished with that one. It was just to say thank you very much for listening to me this morning.
Oh, okay, Jen. Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got 7 minutes left for the Q&A.
Well, that's more than I've had in the past.
Exactly. Continual improvement, that's what it's all about. No, it was really great overview, that, and lots of good tips. It's very important, supplier management, as you say, garbage in, garbage out. It's not always easy. You can have lots of suppliers, and they can be all across the world. But yeah, some great tips there. So there was absolutely tons of comments. So I've scrolled all the way to the bottom. Lisa and Patricia asked similar things. Does BRC cover FISMA requirements? Does SQF cover FISMA requirements?
With the BRC and SQF have modified their scheme as much as they can to meet FISMA, but they're not 100%, because you have to remember that FISMA is a U.S. Requirement, a U.S. regulatory requirement, and the GFSI, BRC, SQF, they're international requirements, so they can't go full force into FISMA. Now, having said that, they also have a requirement that you must meet regulatory requirements. So if you are going into the U.S., that regulatory requirement is having FISMA. Both actually BRC and these are the three that I'm most familiar with. FSSC 22000, BRC, and SQF all have a bit of a gap assessment. So if you are having to put FISMA in place and have one of the GFSI, I would recommend that you go to their website and to pull the gap assessments that they've done, and just to see where there may be a little bit of a gap that's there for full FISMA compliance.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Dion was saying, how can you effectively validate that a supplier in a foreign country has adequate measures in place to prevent intentional adulteration and other risks if I have to conduct a site visit? It's too expensive. Can we find a trusted partner in the country to conduct a site visit or audit?
Yeah, it can be part of it, and the key word there is trusted. To go through. It might be that, and we find a lot of times with foreign suppliers that they will have a GFSI audit that has been done. Again, part of it is just confirming that it looked at the same process you're buying from, that it's the address that you're buying from, and how old is that that GFSI audit that was in place.
Yeah, and some of the GFSI standard holders, SQFB, actually, they have databases where you can go and check certificates.
And that is key.
Yeah. Okay. Charlie's asking, is there an online training for PCQI? Do NSF offer any online training for PCQI?
NSF does not. I saw that there are different ones. If you go on to FSPCA, Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, they will show what the different training programs that are available for PCQI. We at this time only offer face-to-face, but there's a number of training organizations that offer the online. Now, part of it is that the online, there still has to be one for the PCQI. There still has to be a portion of it that is a face-to-face in order to complete the exercises that are required.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Stephanie was asking, is there a gap analysis between FISMA rules, requirements, and GFSI schemes? I think you've mentioned that.
It's for the individual scheme owner has done that. So if you go to your individual scheme owner and look and just do FISMA gap, oftentimes it will come up with their gap analysis that was there.
Okay. Picky is asking, what about when receiving from a distributor and they do not want to share the docs? How do you go on?
It's something that you're going to have to, if you, any of the GFSI programs, FISMA, you need to go back to, and they're very clear on this, you need to go back to the processor, the grower of that product, because you need to be able to assess the practices of that grower. And so it may mean that you have to, and this is where getting that management commitment in there, is if you're buying from that broker, that distributor, is that they need to understand that they have to have assessed the programs. Now, one of the things is that, and this is where the FSVP, that Foreign Supplier Verification Program in the U.S., that's the U.S. FDA is making that the responsibility of the importer to have done that. So that distributor, now having said that, that distributor may have done an evaluation of the people that they're purchasing from, in which case they may be able to give you that evaluation. So there may be some things that you can work around, but if they won't tell you, if they haven't done their own evaluation, they won't provide you with that evaluation, won't tell you who they get the material from, you're at risk that there's going to be a problem.
Yeah, everybody's got to do their bit.
Yeah.
Francis, what can a small business do, and what tools can be applied to enable supplier assurance? Tools.
Some tools. I think part of it is that looking at, as I showed some of the FDA, looking at some of the websites that would be there, some of the government websites that would be in place, some other tools.
Yeah. I don't know if Francis means tools from actually. I mean, I've always in the past used Excel with all the suppliers, and then
Mm-hmm.
you know what for each supplier what's needed, what's required to hold, because obviously there's different risks, different suppliers. You know, you might.
It is very much.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
I can't think of anything else right now.
Let's have a look. I don't know if you can see any more questions there, Jem. Um, Again, Abdul's asking about buying from a distribution company. I think that's a big issue, isn't it, where you buy a lot of ingredients from distributors, brokers.
It is, and it's one of the things, actually, BRC put the program in place last year. SQF is requiring it. FISMA is requiring it. They're saying that you must be able to identify where those materials came from, and to ensure that, because you're looking at potential hazards and the risks that were introduced at either the growing stage or the processing stage. So I think that distributors are probably going to be finding that if they don't release that information, or they don't have that information themselves to be able to provide you with, that they're probably going to lose a lot of their business. So you may be finding some of the distributors more willing to provide that information than perhaps they've been willing to provide in the past.
So, sorry, Jen, did you just mention then that BRC have a standard for agents and brokers?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
They do. And so that's one thing, that if your broker is certified under one of the GFSI, the BRC agents and brokers, they've done all of your work, pretty much all of your work for you. So, I mean, you don't have to go further back from that because it's already been done. So it's really looking at what that agent and broker have they done, and that's, as I said, under the FSVP, they may have done the supplier, the looking at the hazards with the supplier, approving the supplier that's there. So they may have some information they can provide you with.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Dawn, what would be primary aspects to check when carrying out a supplier audit, as there is a lot to cover? If you had to pick sort of maybe a few things, what to focus.
Okay, I have a note here. My three top things, if I was going in to a new supplier, my three top things that I would ask for is, I would ask for their hazard analysis, to be able to look at their hazard analysis. I would ask for their customer complaints. And if they say they have none, I'm going to look at them very skeptically, because I have worked in industry long enough to know that there's always some customer complaints. And I would ask for their audit results if they'll provide them to me. But if they don't want to release the entire audit report, I want to see their non-conformances and their corrective action. So those are my top three things: their hazard analysis, their customer complaints, and their corrective actions for the
Brilliant.
non-conformances.
So, had you anticipated that question, or?
Well, no, I just realized when somebody asked that it was on my notes to put through when I was speaking, and I hadn't covered it. So thank you,
Brilliant.
whoever asked that question. It gave me a chance to go back and address it.
Super. Same question again, multiple suppliers. Anything else that is different or new? We are a storage facility and have nothing in-house but customer product. Is it necessary to get ingredients from them?
Part of that one is that it really depends on your storage. If your product is coming in and it's all fully packaged, it's not exposed, I'm going to say no. If it happens to be something that may be more that the product is not fully packaged, it could be exposed, you may want to know what's in there, just so that you can provide that information to other customers so that they would know what would be potential for cross contact.
Okay, thank you. Lisa says, so it's not required to give the full audit.
This is always one I sit on the fence. Is that if I'm working with a client and they're asked to provide their full audit, I usually try and get and have them not provide it. If I'm working with a client and they have a supplier, I will try and get the full audit. If I can't get it, if we can't get it, then at least the non-conformances, because that's really what you're interested in, is what are the non-conformances and what was the corrective action that they put in place.
Exactly. And the whole purpose of GFSI is, it used to be once certified, recognised everywhere. So if we're trusting in the GFSI system, then why duplicate?
Exactly.
I always believe that it's good to visit a site to get to know the people, get a feel for the place, and not necessarily to do a 20-page audit. But like you say, look at the key things, walk around. You can feel and smell the culture, can't you, usually, by just visiting.
And exactly.
Yeah, and just do whatever you can based on risk assessment of what level of risk the supplier is. Right. Anything else? Have you picked anything else up there, Jen?
Stephanie was just asking, I saw customer complaints to ask for the records or procedures. If I can, I don't necessarily need to know what all of their particular customer complaints, but I want to know, are they, it's not just the procedures. I'd like to look at what's there. Are they getting a lot of customer complaints about foreign material? So, I mean, they could just provide a summary of the type of complaints. Are they about foreign material? Is it about flavor? Is it about shelf life that would be there? So I'm looking at that to kind of get an idea of what the problems would be, and then to be able to associate that with my own product.
Yeah, and I suppose carrying on from that, following, sort of say, well, if these are the trends, let's have a look at what projects you've got and what corrective
Exactly.
you've got
Exactly.
going in this area. Okay, right. I think we'll leave it there. You've got Marty, thanks for the presentation. Amazing. Well, you can't say better than that. So it's been a pleasure again, Jen. So I hope you can, I know you won't be at Food Safety Live, but definitely you'll be one of the top of the list I'll be asking next year for the program.
That's great.
So,
looking forward to it.
Much appreciated. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. Bye now.
Right, ladies and gents, all there is to do is to load your certificate in the sidebar. Just a reminder, that was Jennifer McCreary, and Jennifer's got a very long title, so I have to read it. Technical Manager, Training and Education Services, Global Food Division, NSF International. And Jen's a great speaker, always lots of practical advice, so many thanks to Jennifer. Thanks for attending today. Next week, we've got the practical HACCP training, which is a $97 4-hour training course. It's very good if you need a refresher, or you've got some members of your HACCP team who might want to join and get some formal training. Apart from that, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time, but we'll send you the details of that. As I say, every week it's Friday. Happy Friday. Enjoy your weekend. Keep safe. And let's hope it's a nice long weekend. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye.